Part 5, Chapter 31, The Slow Recovery. A joke states that running a company, you only have to work half days. Simple, you choose which 12 hours. Kevin and I meant business. We started as we meant to go on, fighting on all fronts and working at least 12-hour days to begin with. I could have never achieved the company's recovery without Kevin's help, and we both worked tirelessly together with the shared common goal of us surviving the first 3 months. When the first 3 months had passed and we were still in business, we extended our goal to survive for another 3 months. And when that period arrived and we were still trading, we set ourselves a more ambitious goal of surviving for the next 6 months. We didn't really rest until 2012 and always felt that we were living on borrowed time. We both had a very long what-to-do list and started work immediately. The first task was to draw up an action plan to manage the company's debts. Since any of our creditors could at the time have submitted a wind-up petition to close us down, it became essential that we adopted a complete change of approach, and we were proactive in engaging both our staff, our clients, and our creditors. We consulted with an organisation who had promised to park all of our debts into an arrangement called a CVA, which stood for Compulsory Voluntary Arrangement. This would protect us from any attempt to shut us down by issuing us with a wind-up petition. After a week of them working, during which they'd entered all of our creditors' invoices into their system and were ready to press the button to commence repayment negotiations, we hit a snag. We suddenly realised that in this type of financial arrangement, we were forbidden from buying any more equipment on finance until we'd paid off every single creditor. Not being able to sign leases to buy the latest kit would be immensely limiting to our recovery. So having realised that the CVA idea was a mistake, we now cancelled our agreement with them. But before this could be done, we had to part with £6,000 of hard-earned and very valuable cash. I now worked on a 3-year business plan which would see us paying off all debts and presenting this to all of our creditors for approval. I speedily wrote this and personally agreed unofficial repayment plans with everyone, and so began our new partnership and 3 years of very hard work to restore the firm to profitability. I had dinner one evening with Peter Zack, who ran our West London edit facility, and negotiated an agreement where he and his partner would buy the edit business outright from us for £100,000. I was extremely pleased with this result, but on telling Mum my good news, instead of her being happy, she criticised me for selling it too cheaply. Now I knew that I'd made the right decision to go it alone. We had closed our Avid rental division the previous year, and this would spell the end of VMI having any editing or post-production facilities, relying solely on rental revenue to power the business going forward. It was also essential for us to give up our Soho facility too, since this was both really expensive to run and also deemed non-essential. The lease remained our responsibility, so I advertised the 2 floors of the Darblay Street building to sublet it, and found 2 guys, Claudio and Henan, who wanted to turn this into a cafe. The best news was that they wanted to continue working with us to run the downstairs screening room and for it to retain our branding. The deal agreed was that I would provide and look after the equipment, and they would pay the bills. Result! They branded it the 16mm Cafe, and it would soon become a regular place for me to meet clients in Soho and avoid the enormous overhead. We became good friends, and Henan taught me how to make quiche and short crust pastry. Sadly, the high cost of rent and business rates would mean that this too would close down in 2 years' time, since even they struggled to pay the bills and make a profit. Once again, old assets were ruthlessly sold, and we worked hard to stick to the repayment plans that we had promised. Over time, VMI's historic debts for suppliers, taxes and overdue leases reduced from $429k in April 07 to $200k in April 08 to $65k in May 2010 and finally nil in 2011. We made sure that everybody was paid every penny that we owed. However, the video dealer that we'd owed $169k to back in 2007, what of them? We made sure that they were paid everything that we owed them too, though it would take us 3 years to achieve this. They were really impatient and extremely unpleasant to deal with. and during this time issued us with 3 separate wind-up petitions, and we had to fight them all. Their justification was that we'd not paid them back quickly enough, but we demonstrated to the courts that we were trying as hard as we could, so these were quashed every time. You won't be surprised to hear that we didn't buy any more equipment from them ever again. Back to 2007, having shed some staff just 7 months before in November 2006, we now had to let even more staff go, and the company shrank to just 10 people. The building was like a ghost ship now compared with just a few years before, when our staff had numbered 23. I remember a Monty Python skit where a man visits a hotel and rings the doorbell, whereupon a doorman comes to greet him. The visitor walks to the main desk, and the doorman quickly goes behind the desk, removes his hat and livery jacket, and books the visitor in. The same hotel operative rings a loud bell on his desk, after which he speedily dons another hat and coat, runs to the other side of the desk, takes the visitor's luggage and escorts him to his room. You see the picture now? Well, VMI seemed a bit like this at the time. Back in 2007, without a receptionist, I answered most of the calls myself, and the rental desk consisted of just me and a part-time client contact, but it was mainly me. I answered all calls with gusto, took most of the bookings and negotiating, also did all of the invoicing, project managed all of the important jobs, and looked after the marketing, IT, finance and website. Kevin and a couple of technicians looked after all of the kit prep, returns and logistics, and Jay was our solitary driver. The head of accounts had already left when the crisis first broke, and this was just as well since we couldn't have afforded him anyway. By this time, however, our accounts assistant, Chow, had really impressed me and was to become a very important part of VMI's recovery, and today is another of our key directors. Some of our larger clients were surprised when the managing director kept answering the phone, but I made light of it and explained that I was once again getting close to the customer and enjoyed it, but the truth was that there was no one else. Mum and Dad still came into work every day, but this didn't last long. It became really awkward continuing to work with Dad after what had happened in the boardroom. A week after our fateful meeting, he and I had another argument, and after a terse exchange, he looked at me and asked whether I would prefer it if he were no longer here. I thought about it for a moment and said yes, and he left. He wouldn't work at VMI again after this. The concepts of HD were very technical, and this is why my seminars and lectures had been so popular, but now, of course, I had little time for this. Since it was so time-consuming to speak to every client and explain the finer technical considerations of HD which people needed to know, I had the idea to write technical papers and production case studies and post these onto our internet site. This way, I could point people to our website and educate them, and we would be able to save time on the phone with clients, and everybody would become better informed as a result. These technical pages were very popular, so much so that I was actually told off by one of my competitors for making this valuable information too accessible to the industry. They argued that this specialist information was their USP, their unique selling point that they traded upon, but my opinion is that sharing is caring, and I wanted to share this widely, and it's something that we continue to do today. Chapter 32. Making it up with Dad. Kevin and I had agreed that we would be paid a low income for a limited time, and at least until the worst had passed. During this period, we continued to pay a small income to Mum and Dad. The company was on its knees and worth very little, but I knew that with hard times coming, if I wanted to keep Kevin committed, then I needed to give him something more than just a promise and a low salary. I decided that from now on, we would be paid exactly the same, and in time would also gift him half of my shareholding. Whilst this might sound generous now, my argument was that 50% of something was much better than 100% of nothing, and I needed to ensure that he would stay with me through these very testing times and not be tempted to take a more attractive offer if one should come along. That summer was a frenetic blur of energy. We worked very hard to make progress on all fronts, whilst also keeping the business going with fewer people than we had thought possible. Of course, as well as managing the finances of the company, we also needed to buy new equipment as well, since no one wants to buy last year's model of anything. This was hard to achieve, and the finance terms were expensive since we were a shaky company, but it was sadly necessary. Each time that we did this, we would defer some of the VAT to the next quarter to avoid a large unaffordable tax bill. And although making each quarterly VAT return payment was touch and go, we always just managed it. I can honestly say that I don't know how we pulled through every time, but I'm very happy that we did. Some years later, Nick, my accountant, confided in me that he never actually believed that we would pull through, though happily he didn't share this with me at the time. I had a lawyer look at the terms and conditions of our police monitoring contract of our alarm company to see if there was any scope for us to sue them, but with the absence of any third-party liability, we were more likely to win the lottery. Being a mathematician and understanding the odds, I don't even play the lottery. The best and most likely outcome for us was to sue the insurance company, but success was no foregone conclusion since we clearly hadn't fulfilled our obligations as directors. But if we were successful, then this would give us a slug of money to pay off a large chunk of what we owed to our creditors, so this was something which Mum jumped on. The good news was that an old school friend of mine called Costas was by now a senior solicitor in a firm which specialised in insurance claims. He agreed to take the case and attack this like a Rottweiler. Our insurance company seemed in no hurry to settle, as they kept claiming that there were no grounds for a claim, didn't even really seem to take the threat seriously. No police monitoring in place, they kept saying. We had several meetings at Costas's very posh offices in London's financial district, and I remember arriving, wearing my yellow bike apparel and feeling very out of place on seeing my smartly dressed friend in an elegant suit in the same room together. Eventually, though, Costas's perseverance paid off, and after a year of action, the insurance company made a settlement offer for $100,000, which we accepted and was really welcome. They called it a nuisance payout, but I didn't care. Money was money, and we didn't have enough of it. We were still obliged to pay the considerable legal costs owed to Costas's firm, though he had agreed that we would pay mates' rates, and these were much less than they ought to have been, for which I remain very grateful. Costas ended up making partner and has done extremely well for himself. Finally, January 2008 arrived, and I made it up with Dad. We met for lunch at the 16 Mill Cafe, and I decided to take a well-earned day off. We sat in the middle of the cafe and both enjoyed Henan's terrific quiche, during which someone approached our table to speak with me. Dad dutifully stopped eating and sat back in his seat, expecting me to start engaging with a client. After all, he would have thought, this was business, and business comes first. Instead, I told the client that I was busy right now with my dad, and that I would meet him at his office later that afternoon when I'd finished. In doing so, I could see that Dad was impressed and appreciated this gesture, since he too deserved my time. After lunch, we went downstairs and the two of us watched a private screening of our favourite James Bond film, Diamonds Are Forever. Of course, what else? We were getting on better now, and Dad visited our home in Kent that weekend to celebrate Cheryl's birthday. Just before he left, I asked him if he might like to visit my local pub with me, as I'd never enjoyed sharing a beer with him. He thought about it and declined my offer. No, not this time, but perhaps next time, he said. And I think he really meant it as a genuine offer of friendship to repair our relationship. Sadly, next time never came, and just a week later, whilst on holiday skiing in the Austrian Alps, I received a call from Mum that Dad had suddenly passed away. He'd suffered a massive heart attack and had abjectly refused to take the beta-blocker medication which had been prescribed to him. For years, the doctors had feared that he'd had an underlying heart condition, but he steadfastly refused to believe them or to take their advice. Instead, he firmly believed that as a passionate runner, he wouldn't need to take any medication. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, he would say with a smile. Sadly, he was wrong and paid the ultimate price for this. He was just 67. We buried him in early March 2008, and I'm still sad when I think about the wasted opportunities that we could have had together, but console myself that at least I had an opportunity to make things up with him. Chapter 33. 650,000 hours. At about the turn of the millennium, I decided to find out exactly how many hours there were in the average life. I was extremely surprised to calculate that 74 years of living equated to just 650,000 hours. What surprised me was that I could actually visualize this number. In fact, until 2006, nobody had ever lived to the required age of 114 years old to survive for a full 1 million hours. Clearly, as a cricketer and one who has never as yet scored 100 runs, my aim is not to make, if not 1 million hours, then at least to survive for 100 years. The thing that surprises me most about life is how much of it many people seem to spend not actually enjoying it. I, for one, try to enjoy every day and everything that I do, and whilst not everything that I do is enjoyable, at least I relish the satisfaction of completing a boring task and then ticking it off on my what-to-do list. I love finding ways to make my life more productive and to find new ways of doing things and making them fun. Don't misunderstand me, they don't always work, but I always enjoy the process. Some years ago, I was given 2 pairs of cycle socks as a gift, which are made of the best merino wool, and they were really comfortable to wear. Each sock was marked with an L and an R, and they fitted my feet perfectly, and unusually, there were no flappy bits above the smaller toes, which I hate. I looked carefully at how the socks were made, and whilst they were anatomically shaped, with the heel sewn at right angles to the ankle, both left and right socks seemed to be made identically, though each fitted only 1 foot perfectly. I had a theory that the left sock only became a left sock, and similarly with the right sock, as a consequence of me wearing them on one specific foot only. This way the big toe stretched to take the form of whichever foot I wore it on, and this process made them more comfortable to wear. I tested the theory with a new pair of regular socks, and after washing carefully examined them, and did notice that each sock had stretched into a natural left and right sock, though through just wearing them just once. Since then I've been really careful to examine every sock before I put them on, since each now has become either a dedicated left or right sock, and ensure that I continue the process. So, no more flappy bits. You try it. You'll never look back. The reason for mentioning this is that even in the mundane like socks, you can find interest and joy. The year before Josh was born in 1997, after 26 years of accident-free skiing, I did have an accident and snapped the cruciate ligament of my right knee. This required serious and painful recuperation and 2 operations, but I worked hard, did all of the exercises required of me, and made a perfect recovery. However, in doing so, I needed to devote an entire year to recovery and had to give up sport entirely for this period. What would I do? I've always felt that every negative situation usually has a silver lining. There's always a good way to consider any situation which develops that might in some way benefit you. At the very least, it will make you feel less sad about the situation which does develop, but usually I find that I can use it to my advantage. Today we're in the 5th full week of the 2020 lockdown, and I thought that I would use this time to write the book that I've been thinking about since 2011, for example. Back in 1997 I thought to myself that I had always thought about playing the saxophone, and now was my chance. I visited a music store in London's West End and bought the best saxophone that I could afford, as well as some reeds, a music stand, and a book called How to Play Saxophone, and when I returned home started playing that afternoon. I even took lessons and subsequently played Josh every day before he was born. When he was a baby, the sound of the saxophone would settle him and even stop him from crying. When we moved to Kent, I played in my local church accompanying Carol and Claire on keyboard and violin for some years. Then I played for some years accompanying Graham and his group playing music for the local pantomime group called Benenden Players. We enjoyed playing so much that we decided to play our version of extemporized jazz one evening per week in the loft above Graham's garage, and it was a lovely experience. And just like the idiom of the curate's egg, some days and some pieces were better than others. One day, I had one of my 20 original ideas and suggested that we should host a jazz concert outside on our village green to celebrate the Queen's Diamond Jubilee in the following summer of 2012. Frankly, we weren't good enough to host a jazz concert, and the others should have said no, but they didn't. Then time passed, arrangements were made, we continued to practice, and quite soon it was the day of the concert. It rained, and we played, and it was okay, and we raised over £1,000 for good causes, which was great. The following year, we repeated it again, and it rained again, and our performance was slightly better. I played in the first 7 concerts, and the tradition continues today. And it all started with a decision that I made about not being able to play sport, and then later having a daft idea. I like variety. However, whilst I'm a competent cricketer who can bowl off-spin and leg spin, which is unusual, I'm not the best player in my club. I play saxophone, but when I listen to Charlie Parker, who was ace, I can't even get close to copying what he played. I love cycling, but I can't keep pace with the best in the club that I cycle with. Over the years, I've come to terms with the simple fact that if you like to try lots of different things, then you must accept that you won't ever be the best at any of them. I'm a good husband, father, friend, and I do lots of things that I enjoy, and I no longer mind anymore not being the best at anything. Chapter 34. Armed Robbery. Gerard was irritated, as he'd been delayed from leaving work and it was now after 7 p.m. He'd had an early call time for tomorrow's BAT commercial shoot and needed to wait for Jay to return the company's only van to base so that he could take the kit home, because he planned to drive directly to set in the morning. Jay had already dropped off the van and gone home, and now Gerard was on the camera floor making the final prep to his kit before he left. Despite contravening company policy, he was in the building on his own, but he didn't mind. Camera work meant more money for him, and with a young family to provide for, this was always welcome. Suddenly he heard a crash at the door. What was that, he thought. No one was expected this late. He glanced at the CCTV monitor and could see a blur of activity by the front door and hear lots of noise. So when the intruders burst into the camera room, he wasn't entirely surprised, but still felt a sense of shock all the same. This was a robbery. 3 hooded individuals had entered the camera floor wearing balaclavas, and he could see that one of them was carrying a weapon. At first glance, this appeared to be an assault weapon, an AK-47. By the lumbering way that they crashed into the room, they were clearly not professional, and it was obvious from their reaction that they were as surprised to see him as he had been of them. They had not been expecting the building to be occupied at this time and were evidently stressed. "Where are the F900Rs?" Robber 1 yelled. Gerard could hear the sounds of heavy steps going up the stairs. There were others, maybe 3 more. He had to keep his nerve and let his army training take over. He had never thought that the 2 years national service for his native South Africa would come in useful, but he also knew that he needed to keep them calm since these guys were clearly wired. "Where are the F900Rs?" shouted Robber 1 again. He knew that the Sony F900R camcorder was the most expensive camera on our rental fleet, and also knew that the 2 that we did own were out on hire. He thought quickly and figured that these guys weren't very bright, and they almost certainly wouldn't recognize the specific camera, so he took a calculated risk and showed them another camera with a 900 in its model number. The Panasonic SDX 900 was a much cheaper camera than the Sony, but most importantly, they were also in stock. Robber 1 was clearly the ringleader, and he seemed to be okay with the offering, so Gerard breathed easy. The ringleader continued calling out with more demands. "Where are the lenses? Where are the HDWs?" They were clearly stealing to order, and Gerard obliged him as best he could since he realized that there was no benefit in being beaten up. He was greatly outnumbered by the 3 hoodlums on the camera floor, and these were just the ones that he could see. He was surprised, though. He might have expected this in South Africa, but not in Golders Green. As he continued to assist the burglars, he was able to take a closer look at the gun that the ringleader was carrying, and could clearly see that it was actually an air rifle with a Kalashnikov AK-47 magazine crudely welded to it to make it look like a serious weapon. Gerard wasn't fooled, and realized that it was just for show, but he wasn't going to be stupid and let the intruders know that he realized this. A lot of shouting could now be heard from upstairs. What were they doing? Suddenly he heard a loud crash from above his head. The first floor only housed offices, so this must have been the sound of the heavy safe falling to the floor. It was. Gerard kicked himself for not thinking of pressing the panic button when he was first alerted to the burglary, but now it was too late. They beat and tied him up, confiscated his mobile phone, and then put him in the strong room where the valuable equipment was kept. The robbers had emptied the contents of all of the cases and transported as many of the cameras and lenses that they could carry to the front of the building. The plan had clearly been for them to escape in the cars that they'd arrived in, But now Robber 2 found that he couldn't start the car that he'd parked outside and promptly abandoned it, leaving his gloves in the vehicle. The police would later find DNA in the gloves and the fingerprints in the car. I told you they weren't smart. They now changed their plan and decided to steal our van, complete with its company livery, and drove it to the front entrance of the building. More shouting, perspiring, grunting, crashing and banging later, they loaded up and were gone, and so was much of our equipment. Gerard recalls that when being asked later by a police officer if he needed medical attention for the bruise on his face, he declined, declaring that the robber hit like a girl. Gerard was never one for losing his cool or catastrophizing, and as soon as the robbers were out of sight, he wriggled free and discovered that the strong room wasn't locked. He quickly called the police using the company phone system and then called me. I just boarded a train to Kent, but luckily it was still on the platform at Charing Cross, so I immediately left the station and rode to VMI as quickly as I could. The Flying Squad was London's elite police division, who are revered by all of the UK police forces and are only ever called out for the most serious crimes. An armed robbery definitely classes as one of these. They were already at VMI's building when I arrived, and the officers were calm, professional, and everyone knew exactly what to do, in stark contrast to the frenzied shouting, banging, and crashing of just 30 minutes before. Since the building was now a crime scene, I sat in the car park, took my laptop out of my rucksack, switched it on, and connected to the company Wi-Fi network. I called over a senior officer and showed them a map of London with a flashing red spot at the centre of my screen, and explained that this was a live satellite feed showing the exact location of our company van at this very moment. We could see exactly where the robbers were. The police told me that they had never before had access to this information so quickly after an incident and were really impressed. Disappointingly, though, at the time it was not possible to initiate a chase, but we all watched riveted nonetheless. When the van stopped for some minutes at a seemingly random location, we correctly ascertained that this was the address where the burglars had stopped to unload the loot, and shortly afterwards, when the spot stopped, this was the location where our van was eventually abandoned. It had been a very dramatic day. The police had so much evidence from the burglary and CCTV that the burglars were eventually caught, convicted, and sent to prison for a 12-year term, but sadly, in spite of such a hopeful start, we never recovered our equipment. The good news was that on this occasion we were able to benefit from a nice insurance claim, especially since some of our older equipment would now be replaced with the latest equipment, which would help us with our upgrade plan. The bad news was that this would really hurt our already poor insurance record. In fact, we'd been targeted for robberies so frequently that this became our 5th robbery and also our 5th insurance claim in just 2 years. We had actually been victims of a 6th attempt, where intruders had taken out several bricks from our building before realizing that they had broken into a neighboring unit, so thankfully it never resulted in another burglary or insurance claim. Though to make matters even worse, this last burglary had happened just a week before our annual insurance renewal, and understandably, our insurers were no longer keen to reinsure us. I can't blame them, but our premiums more than doubled overnight and we were forced to agree. The insurance company also imposed some new onerous clauses for us, which resulted in us sharing some of the risk with them. So for the next few years, we would only be paid out 50p for every £1 of claim, and we had no choice but to accept this. The armed robbery was a turning point for us, though, as we'd all decided that we would turn the tables on the burglars. From this time on, all of the rental companies would work together. I called a meeting of all rental company owners, and we all met one evening in a private room of the Crown and Two Chairmen pub in Dean Street, Soho. We were competitors and had never before worked together or even been in the same room at the same time, so the mood was a bit tense and reminded me of that classic scene of the meeting of the 5 families in The Godfather 2. The mood softened, and I explained how we had been targeted for robberies and we all needed to fight back. I played them the CCTV recording of the armed robbery and shared some of the learning points of the training that had been given to us by the Flying Squad. If you're interested, they advised us that when confronted with a weapon, we should lift our hands high, surrender, and give them whatever they asked for. And most importantly, we set up a private network to enable us to collaborate together when we wanted to share information, and this was to work very effectively in the future. When a year later we fell victim to a film school student who went rogue and stole £120,000 of equipment, and then another a year later when we were targeted in an elaborate fraud and lost £300,000 of kit, which affected multiple rental companies as well. We started to share information about potential and bogus frauds as well. We all collaborate together now, and as a consequence, fraud and thefts have largely disappeared from our industry. The last fraud was really hurtful for me, since the perpetrator used my late dad to trick me. To explain, Dad had been really popular, and hundreds of visitors and well-wishers had attended his funeral. Many, though, couldn't attend, so I set up an online memorial to enable those who wanted to leave messages of remembrance to share with his family. This confidence trickster had studied this site in detail, and during the 9 times I'd met him over an 18-month period, yes, 9 times, even including a business lunch, he regaled stories of Dad working in his Neasden shop. He'd never met him at all. It all came from the memorial site. I was fooled and even vouched for him to my competitors who suffered losses as well. It would never happen again, and neither would the burglaries. In 2012, we moved VMI to its current building in West London, which is in a secure compound complete with 24-hour security. Since Mum had left VMI shortly after Dad had passed away, Kevin and I now look after insurance and security, and we made sure that we learnt from every single burglary, theft and fraud. We set up new systems, processes and procedures to ensure that these could never happen again. The insurance companies worked with us too and trusted us, and true to our word, after 2012 we enjoyed 7 claims-free years. High insurance premiums are thankfully no longer a problem for us. Chapter 35. Early Successes. Back to 2008, and every small success would see the company becoming just a bit stronger. At the time, I remember thinking about the metaphor of making a fire in a woodland surrounded by wet wood. Firstly, you have to find some small dry kindling, which isn't easy, and then try to light that. Then once it's glowing, you must very carefully shield it using your hands, since any wind might be enough to put out the glowing embers, and our recovery in those days felt just like this. Remaining with my metaphor, the fire wouldn't start to roar, allowing it to consume large, thick pieces of damp wood for some years yet, but those days would eventually come. There was to be another sea change of equipment during 2008, which we describe in the TV world as the Canon 5D Mark II revolution. At the time, camera sensors were really small and they shot pictures with a large depth of field just like with your mobile phone, and they did not look very filmic. But back in 2008, filmmakers had discovered that the first generation of large sensor digital stills cameras were capable of recording video with a shallow depth of field, and this allowed them to shoot low-cost moving images with a film look for the very first time. Sensing an opportunity, we jumped onto this and bought lots of this type of camera and lenses. Once again, it helped us to carve out another niche for our company, since the equipment was cheap, which was crucial for us at the time, and Kevin could apply his film experience to accessorizing it to be acceptable for serious crews. This was very important for professional crews who really didn't want to use it, but were forced to by producers due to its low cost. The successful strategy and double-digit growth that the company had enjoyed in 2008 and 2009 helped us to power through the recession caused by the financial crisis of 2007-2008. Then in September 2009, I visited the annual IBC conference in Amsterdam, where once again I had another glimpse of the future. ARRI was the major player in the film world for manufacturing film cameras, lenses, and the majority of accessories that film crews love to use, but until 2010 they had only manufactured film cameras which used celluloid film. Not long before this, an organisation called RED had released a digital film camera which suffered from poor reliability, and most professional crews were not fans. However, at the ARRI stand that year, there was a large wooden box containing the electronics of a new prototype camera, and next to it a superb viewfinder. ARRI were playing some incredible images of the Munich football stadium at dusk, which were apparently shot with this new Alev 3 sensor, and these were breathtaking to see. Kevin was back in London recovering from a recent spinal surgery operation, so I had come alone that year, and as soon as I saw it, I knew that we had to buy these cameras, which had been given a code name of Alexa. VMI wasn't particularly well known to Ari at the time, but I met with a bunch of senior guys and told them that I wanted to buy the first 2 Alexa cameras in the world. It is fair to say that at the time we didn't have a lot of money, but I was certain that we would make them work. Ari's executives explained that other than the name, the sensor and the viewfinder, there simply wasn't any more information available, but they planned to release these new cameras in early 2010. Somehow, I persuaded them to agree to sell us the first 2 Alexa cameras, which would be delivered in the UK. I wrote an order onto a piece of paper, took an image of it with my phone, and emailed it to Ari. And true to their word, we took delivery of them in early 2010, and the dominance of Ari in the digital film world had begun. Until this point, old-school filmmakers, who are called DPs, which stands for Directors of Photography, engaged in a long-running debate about whether film or digital was better. Thankfully, although film does continue to be used sometimes and is even experiencing a recent revival, this debate has now petered out. However, I understand that Alexa was so impressive to cinematographers that Ari never sold another film camera after its release. Our goal was to supply equipment for drama productions, and by 2011, with the immense popularity of the Alexa and also its extremely limited availability, drama producers were initially biting our hands off to hire them. Here, Kevin came into his own and was able to accessorize our kits exactly to the taste of professional drama crews to deliver a quality rental service that VMI would become known for in time. At this time, Ian joined us, and we created a new position for him of head of drama. Kevin and Ian already knew each other, since Kevin's wife was a focus puller on a drama production for the BBC called Holby City, and where Ian had also worked as DP for many years. Also, Kevin's previous employer used to supply the same production with their kit before he joined VMI. Compared with me, Ian is very understated about his accomplishments. He was a DP for many years, shooting drama, and also directed for a time too. Although he doesn't broadcast this fact, he's also an associate member of the BSC, which stands for British Society of Cinematography, which is a really big deal. One day in early 2010, he decided that he'd had enough of the early starts and unpredictable schedules, which is the norm for location production, so he decided to hang up his light meter and join VMI. Of course, we were very happy to make a new role for him in the company, and his appointment coincided with the arrival of our 2 first Ari Alexa cameras, so he started work in earnest. Drama is a really tough market to break into. Drama crews tend to work together and go from one production to the next and mostly stay in their genre, not tending to veer into features or commercials work. Drama line producers, who make the final decision about where to hire their cameras from, do the same. They hire the equipment from a small pool of companies, and back in 2011, this absolutely did not include us. Kevin, Ian and I were a really good fit and worked together well. Kevin would present the kit the way that the drama crews expected. Ian would already know the crews and line producers, and I was good at raising the finance and making the numbers work. Initially, with only 2 Alexa cameras, we were able to supply equipment for just one show at a time, and Friday night dinner was one of our earliest productions. VMI's Golders Green building was woefully inadequate for us by this stage. As the low ceilings were claustrophobic, the camera test rooms were up some narrow stairs, and equipment is large and heavy. Parking was very restrictive too, and storage and prep space was so limited that all of the available floor area would be taken up with just one major job. As 2011 drew to a close, I was working on my next business plan. We needed to move to a more secure location and had our sights on a brand new building in Acton to move to. However, to be able to afford the massive increase in costs, we would need a sizable increase in revenue and profit. In mid-2010, I wrote a Bet the Company business plan, which would see us buying sufficient equipment to supply 5 concurrent drama projects, and then we would be able to afford to move into this new building. Chapter 36. Remote Teams. Getting the best out of people is a real art, and without a great role model or mentor at the start of my career, I made a lot of mistakes before I was able to master the delicate art of management. We're all totally unique, one-offs, built to order by our parents, so it entirely stands to reason that managing people doesn't work with a one-size-fits-all approach. The paper tower exercise of my formative MBA years showed me how teams might suffer if too many people wanted to take charge, but what I would subsequently learn was that even the way that people process and share their ideas could influence a team's harmony. Every day I generate lots of ideas, and I know that many of them are poor. But when I'm with like-minded people, I can fire new ideas at them, and by bouncing these between us, they can evolve and improve. I would describe my idea of brainstorming to be like passing a rough slab of wet clay to a colleague who, after scrutinizing it, cuts half of it away with a large knife before adding another slab of clay to roughly change its shape, after which they pass it back to me. This process can go on for some time, and each time progressively finer changes are applied until eventually we have a finished plan that we both agree on and which has totally improved my original idea. Dad didn't work this way, though I didn't realize this for many, many years. He would do all of the crafting in his head by working and refining his ideas over several days without mentioning them to anyone. And finally, when he felt that his idea was ready for sharing, he would present me with the equivalent of a finely finished sculpture that he had even burnished. No wonder that he didn't act kindly when I took my large machete to it before adding another slab of wet clay onto one side before passing it back to him as a suggestion of how I felt his design might actually be improved. Dad and I didn't work together well, but at the time I had no conception why, and I wish I could have learnt this lesson earlier. Being aware of how you and others think and work is crucial if you want to work together and enjoy the process. During my time, I've learnt that everyone has their own way of working and is motivated differently. In my role as the company conductor, it is my job to try to learn the individual traits of each person and thus allow everyone to be able to work in their own way and thrive. The wonderful 2002 film My Big Fat Greek Wedding has a scene where the wife explains to her daughter that in Greek culture, whilst the man may be the head of the household, the woman is the neck, who moves the head and can influence where the man looks, this way or this way. I'm not sure about the legitimacy of the man-woman differential here, but my job can sometimes be a bit like being the neck and helping my teams to see a different perspective that they might not have considered before. One day, I met a driver from another company who was waiting for his hire to be ready. I asked him who he was. He told me he was just the driver. I told him that at this specific moment he was the most important person from his organization, and he was really surprised to hear this. I told him that the bosses and client contacts of his company didn't often meet the clients, only the drivers did. So if he was rude, then this would reflect badly on his company, but if he was happy, helpful, and represented them well, then they might have a better impression of his firm. I explained further that if the client was worth perhaps £50,000 a year and they recommended his firm to 5 others, then we could imagine that he was perhaps worth £250,000. Assuming that they continued trading with his company for some more years, then he alone would be looking after a potential £1 million client right now. He told me he'd never considered this before. Everyone needs to feel that they play a valuable role in their organizations, and I have never forgotten this important lesson. Working from home, I had to invent new ways to motivate and manage remote teams, and I adopted my usual approach of trial and error, seeing what worked and then refining it until it worked perfectly. I originally thought that it might be possible to write up a script for the client contacts, which worked for me, and train others on how to use it, just like Jordan Belfort did in the 2013 film The Wolf of Wall Street. But I found that this approach didn't work for us. I learned that it was much better to train people on how to use the business tools available, and then let them put their own stamp on it. And in doing so, they would also have some ownership of it too. In time, I was able to find ways to keep people engaged and motivated without being at work every day. But it was still important for me to have some face-to-face time with both my teams, clients and suppliers, so I reserved Tuesdays for this. When my clients would ask me to meet them for a meeting, say on Wednesday, I would thank them and suggest that Tuesday was better for me, and 9 times out of 10 they agreed. In this way, I managed to squeeze all of my meetings into just 1 day a week. Also very important for me was when I visited the company each week, I made sure that I made time to speak with everyone who was working there on that day. With more staff and 2 sites today, this is harder to achieve, but I still try to adopt this approach, and it's worked well for me. Chapter 37. Bet the Company. It is surprising that the computing giant IBM was initially a Me Too typewriter manufacturer back in the late 1950s. Their bet the company moment came in 1964 when they released their first computer and made the transition to becoming a computer manufacturer. So too did Richard Branson in 1984 when he launched Virgin Atlantic with a vision to make air travel exciting again and turn his company into an airline from previously selling music. Most companies have a bet the company moment at some point in their history, and for VMI this was to come in 2012 when we decided to become a drama camera rental house. We had decided to increase our drama fleet by making a huge investment in equipment to enable us to equip 5 concurrent double-camera drama kits. If we achieved this, then the additional revenue generated would enable us to both afford the repayments on the new equipment and also the rent on a new warehouse. The plan wouldn't work without a new building, since our current building was already too small for us and we couldn't afford the rent on a larger warehouse without the additional business. This was a brave decision to make at the time. We'd had one misstep already back in October 2008, when our poor burglary record forced us to look for a secure location to move to, and we had initially decided on Pinewood Studios, but after more than a year of negotiations and planning, this fell through, and we were to remain in Golders Green for 4 more years, spending money instead on improving our existing facility and better security. By late 2011, and after 4 concurrent years of almost 15% annual growth, we were bursting at the seams in our present building. We'd operated from here for more than 20 years and couldn't put the inevitable move off any longer. Continuing to operate from our current location, aside from it being quite unpleasant for the staff, was actually bad for business, since we were continually forced to shuffle equipment around from one place to another just so that we could free space to operate, and this was highly inefficient. In fact, lack of space caused us to make several errors too, since equipment was frequently misplaced, and occasionally boxes were missed when loading vans, which made us look incompetent and necessitated repeat deliveries. Vans had to be loaded and unloaded wherever they could park in our small dogleg car park, and every heavy flight case had to be carried in and out of the building by hand, sometimes for a fair distance. The rapid take-up of the Arri Alexa cameras gave me great confidence that we could compete in the drama camera market, but our existing chaotic building did not give clients an appropriate impression of our business, and both Kevin and Ian were reluctant to invite crews to visit our warehouse. The camera test rooms were the wrong size, and equipment had to be carried upstairs in order to test, and then downstairs again to load the vans. We didn't even have a dedicated lens projection room, which was expected from a serious supplier, so winning any drama production would be a triumph against the odds. Until this time, we'd only supplied a few dramas with equipment, and none of these were particularly well known. When drama producers asked what productions we had previously supplied equipment for, we would answer Friday Night Dinner, Sensitive Skin and Blue Orange, but they wouldn't have heard of any of them. They would ask whether we'd supplied any others, and we would pause before answering quietly, no. If we were to be successful, then we needed to win a flagship drama that everyone had heard of. We would also need a larger drama fleet with a good choice of lenses and an impressive building. We needed to achieve all of these now, else it would fail. No pressure then. Each drama kit used about £500,000 worth of equipment, so if we wanted to supply 5 concurrent dramas, then we would need to spend about £2 million now, and this would need to include several sets of expensive film prime lenses too to bolster our limited inventory. This was a lot more equipment than we had ever purchased in one go before, and I was aware of the risks, but needed to quantify them to justify the decision. So I wrote a fully costed business plan and performed a comprehensive sensitivity analysis to show what might happen if we didn't deliver. Obviously, certain business failure. At the same time, we also found a suitable building in Acton which could accommodate our business growth for the next 10 years or so, and negotiated a 10-year lease with an easy start for the first 12 months, after which we would pay full whack. We commissioned a design and build company for the fit-out, which was to cost an absolute fortune too, but the good news was that we had a freehold building to sell which would pay for it. We saved money wherever we could, including me selling our old building, saving us £15,000 in fees. This is a little less impressive than it sounds, since the buyer was actually the owner of the business operating next door to us, but I was able to negotiate a higher price than the professional agents thought possible. We had our sights firmly set on winning the ITV drama flagship series of Agatha Christie's Poirot and Marple, and also Mr. Selfridge, and all 3 productions would be shooting during 2012. Our strategy was that if we could win and deliver on these quality dramas, then no one would ever doubt our credentials again, and our drama reputation would be secure. We pushed as hard as we could to win them, and with Kevin and Ian's help, managed to persuade ITV to give us a chance with Poirot and Marple. It really helped that Ian was friends with the line producer of both series, and I remember that he was concerned about whether we could really deliver. He asked Ian straight, could we really deliver, since it was his reputation on the line? Ian promised him sincerely that we could, and the deal was done. We were now supplying cameras for Poirot and Marple. We did a really good job too, and the line producer and crew were so impressed with our services that we would continue to work with them on many projects in the future. It was a close contest with Mr. Selfridge, and we made the final shortlist of 2 companies, but lost out to a worthy competitor. Luckily, several other projects took their place, including Threesome, Some Girls, and then later Midsummer Murders and more. But it was crucial that we had bagged Poirot. Once we told line producers that we'd supplied the cameras for Poirot and Marple, then no further explanation was necessary, and we transitioned to becoming a potential camera supplier for all future UK TV dramas. By the end of 2012, we had successfully delivered on 5 concurrent dramas for most of the year, and I had hit all of my targets. Of course, this meant that we could afford the rent in our new building too. The business continued to enjoy double-digit growth for much of the rest of the decade. More quality productions and happy crews followed, and over time our reputation soared. Dad always claimed to me that we should aim for profit first, but I disagree, as my experience has been that as a rental company, we should primarily aim for customer service, after which both revenue and profit follows. We completed the fit-out of the Acton building in time to move the entire company in January 2012. When it was finished, it looked really professional and gave just the impression that we wanted to convey to clients and crews. It was also a much nicer place to work, with lots of daylight and huge amounts of space which none of us were used to. Acton contained a dedicated lens projection room, 2 test rooms and a garage complete with airlock and electric shutter, so at last we could load and unload with complete security. Also, for the first time we were able to use pallet trucks to allow large consignments of equipment to be moved around the building with ease. I was very keen that this building would be as energy efficient as possible as well, so we imported £10,000 worth of LED light fittings directly from China, since in 2012 these weren't widely available in the UK. We also converted our existing large sodium downlighters to LED, which used just 10% of the power but were just as bright. We fitted plastic floor tiles which had been manufactured from recycled Tetra Paks and which kept the place warm, and even had one made with our logo printed into it, which looked really smart at our main entrance. Large pictures of our equipment and past productions were hung to convey how great our gear was, and the place looked white, clean and tidy. Everything was designed with elegance and efficiency in mind, and DP still describe our building as being like a Formula One workshop, something which we always like to hear. As the business grew, so did the staff, and over time new divisions were added to the business. In 2015, we opened a Bristol branch which specialised in supplying natural history productions and stocks some really long lenses and specialist grip equipment like a stabilised camera mount which can fix to boats or off-road vehicles. In 2017, we opened the V-Media division, which is a specialised rental facility for supplying large, fast memory cards for 4K productions, and which are surprisingly expensive to buy. Then later in 2018, we added power to its product range too. V-Media today supplies international features and drama productions for the popular video-on-demand channels, which have an insatiable appetite for making new productions. The company grew, and so did the people. Remember the lowly accounts assistant back in 2007 who was pulling his hair out to pay the bills when we had no cash? Well, Chow was made financial director back in 2017, and Ian became commercial director at the same time. Also, Stuart, our rental desk manager, became our 5th director recently in December 2019. Whilst we're now a sizable rental company with a wide rental fleet, it has not been all plain sailing, with challenges presented by shocks to the economy caused by snap elections and the uncertainty caused by the Brexit referendum. Even now, as I write these pages, the COVID-19 crisis has stopped the entire worldwide production industry from working for some months. However, having a strong team of professional, competent people who really care about the business means that whatever challenges are thrown at us, we can now handle it. There really is safety in numbers. Chapter 38. Mag. Shortly after moving to Kent, I started an annual tradition in our house, which we've maintained and look forward to at the end of every Christmas break. New Year's Eve for many is a raucous occasion, but instead for us it's a quiet family evening at home, enjoying a cold spread of our favourite foods, followed by an event which we call The Book. After we've all enjoyed eating dinner together, we all retire to the living room, dim the lights, play soft music and bring out our special book which only comes out once a year on this specific evening. I open a fresh page and we discuss the year which has passed, and I write a summary of all of the main events which we agree have shaped the current passing year. As I flick back a few pages, I turn to Cheryl's page, which lists the New Year's resolutions which she had committed to for this year and had written exactly 1 year ago at this very same event. As a family, we discuss each aim in turn, and Cheryl would give an honest appraisal of whether she has been successful in achieving it, and if so, receives a tick. After completing her last year's resolutions, we turn to a fresh page, and here Cheryl writes a new list of resolutions that she wishes to achieve in the coming year, and usually adds the ones that she didn't complete this year. Everyone takes part, and if friends are visiting, they add their pages too. We really look forward to this occasion, and it helps us all to reflect on the year gone by and also look forward to the year ahead. We always insist that the book is not competitive, but I confess I do love to tick off as many of my resolutions as possible. I always add an entry to my list to tick off one item from my bucket list, which is a list of all of the events that I would like to achieve before I kick the bucket. As you might expect, this is quite an eclectic selection, which includes skiing on all 7 continents of the world, performing a ski jump, scoring a century at cricket, and free diving without pressurized air to catch a sea bass with a harpoon, followed by cooking and eating it. Over the past few years, I've rarely been successful in achieving a tick against this specific entry though. However, I'm happy to report that this year I will receive a tick for writing my book, which has been on my list since 2011. On the 31st of December 2016, I had a crazy idea and announced to my family that I wanted to raise £10,000 for MAG that year. Some background here is required. About 5 years before, I had read a book called One Step Beyond by an author called Chris Moon, which opened my eyes to the horror of landmines. The book was an autobiography of a marathon runner who had had an interesting life before being blown up by a landmine, and in which he had lost both an arm and a leg. After he recovered, Moon continued to run marathons, including the fabled Marathon des Sables, which crosses the Sahara Desert and is accurately described as the toughest foot race on Earth. I was really inspired by both his story, grit and determination, but also moved by the inequity of the tragedy that landmines have on so many children who are entirely innocent of the conflicts which they're involved in. I was also impressed with the bravery of those who work to clear them. And after reading this book, I decided to collect for a mine-clearing organisation called MAG, who work tirelessly all around the world to help the 60 million or so people who live in conflict zones and in fear of landmines every day. MAG have made a commitment to help make the world landmine-free by 2020, which I feel is really important, since every day around 20 people somewhere in the world are blown up, and half of them are children. I had been collecting for MAG since 2010, and some of the profits from every jazz concert that we'd ever held were donated to them, but this was just one of several good causes that we donated to, so my share never amounted to more than just a couple of £100, and I felt that I could do more. I had made this announcement to my family without any forethought, and when Cheryl asked me how I was going to raise this impressive sum of money, I told her quite truthfully that I had no idea. However, I wrote an entry on my New Year's resolution page of the book, and the ideas soon started coming. A month later, I launched the Superheroes campaign. I think this name actually came from Gary, who now ran our Bristol division, and it made me laugh, so the name stuck. My idea was that, like the Fireflies 11 years before, a group of cyclists would ride on an impressive journey, and we would ask companies to donate money with sponsorship, which hopefully should raise £10,000. For an impressive journey, it made sense to ride bicycles from London to Amsterdam, and to schedule this for September of that year, since we would be visiting the annual International IBC conference in Amsterdam anyway. I thought that a challenge to ride there would help to encourage the major manufacturers, distributors and dealers to support us who would be taking part at the same event and whom we could meet there to congratulate us. Another consideration was that since a lot of riders had expressed an interest in taking part but couldn't make the IBC dates or the cost, I decided to arrange a second ride from London to Bristol, which we had planned for the summer, and would help more cyclists to take part and thus help with fundraising. Arranging the first year was really tough since everything was new. I arranged the rides, the routes, the health and safety, the places to stop, the sponsors, the jerseys, hotels, etc. Above all, it was tough to persuade so many corporate sponsors to part with their money, but eventually I had confirmed 35 of them, and we managed to raise £12,500, which was fantastic. The 150-mile ride from London to Amsterdam was in its infancy, and our first year included just 2 riders, myself and a DP called Jay, who had pestered me for years to ride with him to Amsterdam. Encouraged by our first year's success, we repeated this for a second year and managed to secure 62 sponsors and raise £22,500, which was really impressive. We increased our numbers to 5 riding from London to Amsterdam that year, though one rider's wife fell sick the day before we were due to leave and he missed the ride, so only 4 of us ended up riding together. At one of the many parties that I attended at IBC that year, my friend Yevgeny whispered to me that he would like to ride with us next year. Yev is a larger-than-life character who has a reputation for hard drinking and hard partying. He's generally the last to leave at all of the big industry parties, but at this time he did not have a reputation for either healthy living or exercise, so I was surprised by his offer. "Yev," I said, "London to Amsterdam is a long ride. We ride for 100 miles on the first day, and this is not for the faint-hearted." But he was not dissuaded. "Barry," he barked in his thick Russian accent, "I will ride next year, but please keep it secret." The look of utter determination in his eyes seemed to convey seriousness, but I wasn't altogether convinced. But he then whispered to everyone in the room who would listen that he would be a Superheroes rider the following year and ride from London to Amsterdam on a bicycle. But they too were sworn to secrecy. His co-director, John, was very amused and approached me with an offer that I could not refuse. "Barry, CVP will sponsor the Superheroes with £2,000 on 2 conditions," he said. "Firstly, I won't do the ride, and secondly, you must not let Yev off the hook." Of course I agreed to this, as £2,000 was way more than the £200 that I'd asked most companies to sponsor. Every month I would ring up Yev and ask him if he had bought a road bike yet. And he told me no, not yet. But eventually in April of the following year, he told me that he had finally bought a bike. And then 2 months later, in June, he confessed that he'd actually started riding it. We were scheduled to cycle to Amsterdam in just 10 weeks' time. I wanted to go out on a high in our 3rd and final year, so I pushed really hard for sponsors, and between us all, we managed to secure 92 corporate sponsors and raised a record £27,500 for MAG. Finally, the day of the ride arrived, and the 8 riders met at VMI in time to make a prompt 8 a.m. start, all wearing their smart superhero jerseys, which had been designed and printed to include 93 sponsor logos on every spare bit of material. Chow and my son Josh were our support team and would feed and water us on our way to Amsterdam, driving a company van. It was the first time that Josh had driven on the continent too, and he did really well. His reward was that I had promised him a hero's evening of celebrations in Amsterdam. Chow and Jay had supported us on almost every previous ride, so it was fitting that at least one of them was with us on our last trip. Sadly, Jay was too sick to make this last event, although he helped us from home by making regular social networking posts to keep our sponsors and supporters engaged. The first day started very well to beautiful sunshine and everyone was in high spirits. I carried a powerful portable speaker on my bike, pumping out the superhero playlist that Josh and I had prepared, which was a mashup of jazz funk, R&B, rap, 60s doo-wop jazz and some 80s sing-along hits, but pretty much all of the tracks had a strong beat in common to keep us going. When we reached the halfway mark of 80 kilometres, which is 50 miles, I complimented Yev on having ridden further than he had ever ridden before. I shall never forget his response, which came with his typically thick Russian accent with a slightly angry tone. "Buddy, my ass is on fire! How far do we have to go?" We laughed out loud and told him that this was the highest point on the route. Not true. That it was all downhill from here. Also not true. And that from here it wasn't really that far either. Suffice to say, we all arrived at Harwich that evening in time for the sleeper ferry that would take us to Holland, and all was still in one piece. Then after a restful sleep, we left the Hook of Holland by bike in the driving rain for the third year in a row. To this day, I have never ridden a bicycle in Holland when it hasn't rained, but I think that this is just bad luck. We did go out in the evening to celebrate having raised over £60,000 during the 3 years of the superheroes rides. But sadly, Josh had fallen ill and had to go back to the hotel early, so missed out on his epic night of partying that had long been planned. All of these memories and all of the money raised for the good cause came from a crazy idea and not being prepared to give up. I continue to support the MAG charity today, which in 2019 alone helped 1 million people to live free from fear, and you too are helping them too, since 10% of all of the net proceeds from this book are being donated to MAG, so thank you too. Chapter 39. Happiness. I used to be very impatient and wanted to be the best at everything. Now I find comfort being in my own skin and not being in such a hurry all of the time. I used to consider arriving early for any event to be a waste of my time, which I hated too. This would include waiting for trains, so I would cut my journey time so finely that I was always stressed before I left, stressed on the journey, and we would sometimes be late, which would irritate Cheryl. I've since broken this bad habit and now leave 10 minutes earlier than I used to, and always know that I have time to spare. As a result, I'm calmer and always arrive on time. I can attest that some life lessons can be this simple, but we have to come to the conclusion ourselves and then decide to break this cycle in order to change and enjoy life more. I've met some incredible people on my journey, and in some small way their influence has moulded me to be the person that I have become, just as I have changed them too. Jay started with the company in 2005 and has been there ever since I can remember. He's such a lovely guy, never has a bad thing to say about anyone, and is a true inspiration to all who has ever had the pleasure of meeting him. From his daily uplifting posts, which he shares on social media, you would have no idea that he is fighting cancer for the second time in his life. He continues to do this with a single aim of wanting to share and make others happy. It was one of Jay's postings in the past that inspired me with the idea of making the Happiness Book. This is a book which lives on my mantelpiece, and every page contains a written memory of a great day that I have experienced. Its first entry was my birthday last year, when my family made a big fuss of me. Josh prepared a lovely family meal, we watched a film, went for a great walk. Every time I flick through the book, I remember happy days and it makes me smile. I heartily recommend that everyone make their own happiness book. Running the company used to consume every available moment of my life, and honestly, some of those times were not pleasant. Now, though, with a better team, stronger balance sheet, good financial controls, tight quality standards and money in the bank, running the company is so much easier and more fun than it used to be. I can't say that it's been an easy voyage, and I faced a lot of challenges along the way, but I am reminded of an ancient Japanese proverb which states that the only way to enjoy a delicious meal is to have endured hunger. Using the same metaphor, I have endured a lot of hunger. However, for the first time in my life, I find myself with more time to allow me to concentrate on other strategies and also more time to think. Over this last year, I've been working to design and launch a new apprenticeship standard, which I hope will provide young people with a structured way to enter our industry. This is as an alternative to avoid the huge expense and uncertainty of attending university, and which isn't necessarily so useful in our creative sector. Our syndicate of rental companies now works together to share good practice with the common aim of all reducing our carbon footprints too and helping to make our businesses more sustainable. In our company, Chow started a group which he calls the Lunch Club, where people cook for each other during the lunch breaks. He and I have also become accomplished bakers, and we enjoy competitive sourdough baking and bringing our cakes and bread into the office for others to enjoy and tell us which they prefer. Most of all, my friends and family are very important to me. In Kent last year, we started the Phillies Fog Society, inspired by the Jules Verne classic novel Around the World in 80 Days. The idea was that friends would meet every 2 weeks to enjoy a gastronomic tour of the world. We'd take it in turns to visit each other's houses and cook meals using recipes of countries of our choosing in order to pretend that we were engaging in a virtual world tour. I love to cook, and to do this with the excuse of sharing our creations and friends of the Phillies Fog Society just makes it a bit more of an experience, which is what I like to do. My life has had lots of twists, turns and drama, and my wife Cheryl has been with me throughout the entire journey. I can honestly say that I could not have done this without her. She has been my rock, and whilst I'm very much an advocate for quality, it always helps to have a supportive partner who can prepare a home-cooked meal and provide a sympathetic ear if things aren't going well. She knows me well enough not to dismiss my harebrained schemes without hearing my reasoning first, like raising £10,000 for Mag. I receive a lot of Facebook notifications from past employees who are now doing interesting things around the world. Dado, who was our first and only avid wizard, now lives in LA with his wife and is another of those people who, on meeting him, leaves a lasting impression. He runs an organisation called Colour Space, and at one presentation that we gave together in London a few years ago, made the announcement that he considered me to be the only boss who could ever manage him. Knowing him as well as I do now, I think this is quite plausible. Another former work colleague lives in Zimbabwe and recently shot a feature film which won an International Film Award. We had lunch together last year when he was in London, and he regaled his fond memories of his time at Golders Green when he started his career as a technician. Several other past employees are now camera assistants and camera operators who shoot features and dramas, and they all have their story to tell. When I see them, they share with me how much fun they had during their time with the company. I feel privileged to have been part of their journey. Working with Mum and Dad was never easy, and certainly nothing that I had ever planned to do. However, my experience had made me the person who I am today. I remember at the time thinking how brave Dad was in his early 20s to have started a company the way that he did. However difficult my journey was, I do owe my parents a debt of gratitude for the opportunity that working for them has afforded me. Whilst I'm now an entrepreneur, just like Bilbo Baggins of Tolkien's The Hobbit, who himself became an accidental hero, I don't mind admitting that my journey was also largely by chance rather than by design. It is easy now to consider where I might have been had I made different choices, but that isn't very helpful because I didn't make those choices. I didn't choose to become a mathematics professor or a derivatives dealer in New York. Instead, I stayed in London and looked after my parents. I like to ponder the concept that we are the sum product of all of our choices, and I like where I have finally ended up. Ultimately, Dad was correct when he stated that you get what you aim for. My advice is to be true to your values and treat others the way that you yourself want to be treated. Use your time wisely. Enjoy life. Be kind and look after your family. If you do this, then like me, hopefully you will enjoy your life to the full. If you're interested, I've uploaded full-colour images, my favourite recipes, and a positivity community on my website called www.fullexperiencaliving.com. I promise no adverts, no cost and no spam. Thank you. Now have a great life. There is actually a bonus chapter which I wasn't sure whether I should put in, but it's going to follow if you want to hear it. It's the Pigeon Steps School of Motivation. The Pigeon Steps School of Motivation. I wrote this to be a chapter in the book, but it didn't really fit, and since so many of us find self-motivation difficult, I've kept this in at the end just in case you find it helpful. If you think about starting any big task, then it's easy to be daunted by the sheer scale of the challenge and to let this dissuade you from actually making a start. I think we're all guilty of making this error, but I find that simply deciding to start is a great way to begin, and starting was what my dad found really hard to do, and which was why he'd often look at the word "go do" written upon the paper in his workshop, and also the reason that it became part of our family vocabulary. This book is an example of my own procrastination, since I first had the idea of writing an account of my recovery from near-certain bankruptcy back in 2011 and wrote an outline plan but never went any further than this. I always had other things to do. However, it remained on the back of my mind and appeared on my New Year's resolutions for 8 straight years with a cross, until a government-imposed lockdown in 2020 gave me 12 straight weeks of not doing my regular job. Then on the 8th day of the lockdown, I started to begin. So I sat down and started, and this book is the result. This is Go Do at Work. My approach has 3 simple parts to it, and each are crucial. 1. Break down your task into lots of little tasks which are actually quite manageable. 2. Begin. 3. Promise yourself a treat when you complete each mini-task. I have adopted this approach my entire life, and it has enabled me to complete some really big projects whilst remaining entirely in control and keeping my sanity. I will even go so far as to say that I've usually enjoyed the projects too. So to begin a really huge task, what you need to do is to sit down with a good cup of coffee and a blank sheet of paper, or a computer with a word processor, and start to write a list of all of the large tasks in order to complete the project. Example, building a bridge. Major tasks, design the bridge, buy the materials, choose a building company, build the bridge, etc. Then break each of the large tasks into smaller tasks, and those into yet smaller tasks. Minor tasks. Look at existing bridge designs. Choose preferred style, find an architect who works in style, etc. Now you have a plan. Now you have to decide to start. This is more easily said than done, but this is the most important factor to gauge whether you're going to be successful or not. Your first task has to be both small and easy, and also possible to complete. So, looking at a first minor task of looking at existing bridge designs, this is easy. So, having written it down, you need to start and complete the very first minor task, and then you can tick it off your schedule. Lastly, it is crucial to find ways to reward yourself to keep you motivated, and then look forward to completing your first small mini-task. In 2007, when I cycled from Geneva to Cannes through the Alps, we would climb each mountain for several hours, and for much of the climbs we were below the tree line, and you couldn't see much beyond 100 metres in front of you, so it was really hard to see any progress at all. We would cycle uphill for hours, and I knew it would be hard to keep myself motivated, so my strategy was to bring along a compact altimeter with me and monitor my altitude as I cycled. My mini goal became climbing just 50 metres of altitude. 50 metres is easy, but climbing 2,000 metres is hard. The full ascent would see me achieving 40 of these mini goals, so each time I climbed 50 metres, I would feel great, and that was my reward. And of course, eventually arriving at the summit was even better. Perhaps your reward might be to watch Netflix after completing your assignment or chapter, or perhaps to enjoy a biscuit, or perhaps even just to tick off an item on your what-to-do list, which is often my motivation. But whatever it is, enjoy the satisfaction of starting, and then make sure that you enjoy the reward for completing your task too. A final tip, which I still find useful and do today. When I was studying, as soon as I had completed a study session, I would intentionally leave my books open and set up, ready for the next time that I would start studying. It was really important for me that the book was open at the appropriate page with a blank sheet of paper and pen at the ready, so when I sat down, I wouldn't have to think about what I needed to do. If you do this, then you can't talk yourself out of starting, since by now you will have already begun. I even used this approach when writing this book, albeit computer left on, word processor document open at the right place. Chapter over. Book complete. I'm ready for my reward now. A shower and a lovely cup of coffee. Have a great life.